Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar on the New York Cap and Invest. I'm Alana Cadell-Tuckey, the Director of the Office of Environmental Justice here at DEC. Can we sit to the next slide? I'm pleased to be joined today by representatives of New York's environmental justice and climate justice organizations. Gloria Boyce-Charles, a Southeast Queens advocate and longtime resident of Brookville community. Monique Fitzgerald with the Long Island Progressive Coalition. Eunice Coe with New York City Environmental Justice Alliance, and Eric Walker with We Act for Environmental Justice. Thank you so much for being with us here today. We're also joined by several staff members from the Department of Environmental Conservation and from NYSERDA. Over the past year, DEC and NYSERDA have held webinars and meetings focused primarily on garnering feedback to inform and develop the regulations that will govern emissions control side of the program, and the feedback is greatly appreciated. Today, we are going to focus on gathering input on how proceeds from the sales of emission allowances can be invested. This is a really important component of the program that's not covered by the regulatory process. Input from environmental justice and climate justice stakeholders and the general public is essential to ensuring that the investments of these proceeds accomplish the goals of supporting climate change mitigation through energy efficiency, clean transportation, and more. Improving air quality and health outcomes, and driving investment in communities that have historically been overburdened by environmental pollution. So with that, I'm going to pass this over to Ryan from Cadmus to describe the procedures for today's webinar. Ryan.
Thank you. As an attendee, you will not be able to unmute or turn on your video. Attendees will, however, be able to submit questions via the Q&A feature. Select clarifying questions will be answered. If you're having tech issues and would like help, you can also submit a request via the Q&A feature. We will do our best to assist you. If you can't hear the presentation, you can configure your audio settings by clicking the arrow in the audio box. This will allow you to change the speaker settings. If you're having connectivity issues, you can also press switch audio to phone, and this will allow you to listen to audio of the webinar through your phone. Today's webinar will also offer live captioning and translation services. You can turn on closed captioning for the presentation at the bottom of the screen. You can also change the language of the captions by changing the translation to setting. Finally, this webinar is being recorded, and the webinar recording will be posted on the New York State website at ny.gov. So next slide, please. I will turn things back over to NYSERDA.
Thank you, Ryan. And especially thank you to all those that are joining us today as panelists and as attendees. I'm Ansela Alozi, the Director of Energy and Climate Equity at NYSERDA. We are very much looking forward to hearing from our panelists and the public on how proceeds from the Climate Investment Account will be invested. For our agenda today, we will start by providing a brief overview of NYCI. We will then cover the structure established by law on the use of NYCI proceeds, early input received, and a draft proposal for how and in what areas NYCI proceeds will be invested. Then we will engage in a discussion with our panelists on the proposed framework and investment areas, seeking their feedback on key questions. We'll then take a short break before moving on to answer some questions from attendees, and then close with a walkthrough on how to submit comments. Please feel free to submit your questions at any time during the webinar. Please keep in mind that today's webinar is on the use of proceeds, which is separate from the development of the regulations that will guide the New York Cap and Invest program. We will not be able to answer questions related to the regulation development on today's webinar. As a reminder, to receive email alerts on upcoming events, please sign up for the Climate Act mailing list by visiting climate.ny.gov and following the Sign Up for Updates link. The slide decks and recording of today's webinar will be posted on the Cap and Invest website, capandinvest.ny.gov. You can find the materials and recordings for past webinars and details for future webinars on the meeting and events page. Comments are submitted via the website by clicking the Submit Investment Comments button. This is separate from the comment form where we are accepting feedback on the regulatory pre-proposal. This form is specific for the Climate Investment Account, and Samir Ranade from NYSERDA will provide screenshots towards the end of this webinar to demonstrate how to submit comments via the website. If you have any questions on how to comment, please enter them into the Q&A and we will answer them at the end of the presentation. I'll now turn it over to Alana for a brief overview of the New York Cap and Invest program and context on the Climate Act.
Thank you, Ansela. Next slide, please. Of course, the background for Cap and Invest starts with the requirements of the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, or the Climate Act, as NYCI program will be a key part of our suite of programs to help meet the emissions limits and the other requirements of the Climate Act. So the Climate Act sets a path towards carbon neutral economy and mandates that at least 85% of statewide greenhouse gas emissions be below 1990 levels by 2050, with a near-term requirement of 40% reduction by 2030. So to help us achieve these directives, the Climate Act also mandates 100% zero emissions electricity by 2040. In addition, it also calls for 6,000 megawatts of distributed solar and 185 trillion BTU on site energy savings by 2025, 70% of renewable energy, and 3,000 megawatts, I hope I'm saying that right, of energy storage by 2030. And 9,000 megawatts of offshore wind by 2035. You don't have to remember any of this. We'll make sure that everybody has it just so we have all those numbers and it's all in the legislation. In addition, the Climate Act also contains critical commitments to climate justice and to just transition. So these climate justice and equity principles are key for DEC and NYSERDA as we design this cap and create this cap and invest system. So again, the NYCI program that we're talking about is a key part of the state's suite of policies that ensure that we're delivering on these requirements, but it's not the only program. So NYCI components also it complements a variety of existing programs and policies as part of the state's overall portfolio and to deliver on these key requirements of the Climate Act. Next slide, please. So again, recognizing this slide will look familiar to a lot of you. I want to briefly show the current makeup of greenhouse gas emissions in the state and the reduction requirements of the Climate Act. So here we provide graphical depictions of the composition of the current greenhouse gas emissions inventory and the reduction requirements under the Climate Act as per the 2023 statewide greenhouse gas inventory, which uses the data from 2021, which is the most recent data we have available. So in the graph on the left, the sectors and their relative contribution to statewide emissions are highlighted. In the inner ring, while the individual components of those sectors and their relative contributions are identified in the outer ring. So under the accounting that's required by the Climate Act, the building sectors and transportation sector are the largest contributors, and they make up more than 50% of our statewide emissions. Because NYCI is intended to be an economy-wide program, it's going to cover emissions from all sectors, although only a portion of these emissions are going to have an allowance compliance obligation that actually fall under the program. So again, looking in the graph on the right, we're highlighting where we were in 1990 and in 2021 and where we need to be based on the emissions limits that are under the Climate Act. So the emissions limits established under the Climate Act are going to serve as an emissions cap for 2020 and 2050 for the NYCI program, and we'll explain this further in subsequent slides. Next slide, please. So the Climate Act created the Climate Action Council, whose job was to develop the scoping plan of recommended actions to achieve the mission of our reduction requirements. So New York's final scoping plan was published at the end of 2022, and it's the result of a process that spanned about 3 years of diligent and inclusive work, building on the recommendations from several 7 sector-specific advisory panels and the Just Transition Working Group and the Climate Justice Working Group as well. So it was informed by extensive public input. There was a 6-month comment period where we heard from New Yorkers during public hearings all over the state and received over 35,000 written comments. The scoping plan is the framework for how New York State will reduce our greenhouse gas emissions and achieve the net zero emissions, increase our renewable energy use, and also ensure that all communities equitably benefit in the clean energy transition. It provides recommendations for both sector-specific and cross-sector actions to achieve the Climate Act's goals and requirements. One of the key recommendations from the scoping plan was an economy-wide cap and invest program, which was identified as the most cost-effective means for achieving the Climate Act's emission limits. Next slide. So Chapter 17 of the final scoping plan addresses the economy-wide strategies. The scoping plan chapter provides helpful context, including the background and the criteria for evaluation of economy-wide strategies that lead to the recommendations for the cap and invest program, as well as the proposed program design elements that serve as informative recommendations and the starting point for state's cap and invest program. So consistent with these recommendations from the scoping plan, Governor Hochul announced the development of an economy-wide cap and invest program in her 2023 State of the State address and directed DEC and NYSERDA to establish that program. So last year's state budget advanced the program a bit further, including through the creation of a financial foundation required to support the economy-wide cap and invest program. So DEC and NYSERDA have been developing this program as a part of our overall state profile of climate and clean energy policies to help meet the greenhouse gas emissions reduction requirements that are in the Climate Act. So the regulatory pre-proposal materials that agencies released last year, that provides the framework for the emissions control side of the NYCI program. Next slide. So in summary, it's going to start with setting a declining cap. So there is a declining cap, and the requirement to retire compliance instruments and principal allowances. Sorry, the allowances most distributed, they're going to be distributed via auction, and so it's going to be proceeds. A third is going to be affordability, 2/3 to green energy transition, and the whole point is to ensure an equitable transition, and there's no disproportionate impact. So this slide, you see that it's also there. It's a summary of how that program is going to work. If you look at the top two boxes, you're going to see the depiction of how the program works. The boxes on the graph cover the program's components, and those are governed by the regulations that DEC and NYSERDA are developing. So first, the program, like I said, is going to set a limit, a cap on the annual amount of greenhouse gas emissions emitted by the state. So each year, the emissions cap is going to decline and to reduce greenhouse gas emissions overall. And that's going to help that together with all the other complementary programs that the state is on a trajectory to actually achieve the statewide greenhouse gas emissions limits. So the second feature, which is a key feature of the program, will be a legally enforceable regulatory requirement that all large source greenhouse gas emissions to purchase or obtain emission compliance instruments, principally allowances for each ton of gas emissions associated with their activities. So in order to comply with the regulatory program at the end of the relevant time period, these obligated sources are going to have to provide DEC with emission allowances in a quantity that covers their associated emissions. So these emission allowances will be provided to DEC for compliance purposes, and then they're permanently retired, meaning they can't be used again by the source to cover any of the, cover another ton of emissions. So because the initial amount of emission allowances issued by the state is limited, and capped basically, and declines every year, we have a legal and regulatory assurances that greenhouse gas emissions will in fact decrease over time, together with other complementary programs and subject to other components, obviously, of the NYCI program that we'll describe today and through the following days. Third, most emission allowances will be sold by the state through auctions. The resulting proceeds from the state auctions of those emission allowances will be utilized for multiple purposes, including the third that's going to go directly back to New Yorkers to address energy affordability, and the 2/3 that will go towards projects and actions that reduce emissions. So this is covered in the bottom half of the graph and is the focus of our session today. So last year's enacted state budget established funds in the state budget to further advance this element of the program, which we're going to go into detail in just a moment. And as always, at the top of our minds, designing this program is the priority of frontline disadvantaged communities. We know that these communities have long suffered from pollution as a result of longstanding environmental injustice. So this program is going to ensure that we get those emissions reductions. The focus on disadvantaged communities and ensuring investments and benefits, importantly, improved health accrue in such communities is again a key principle for us and a requirement under the Climate Act. So NYCI is going to be, it's designed according to those the 5 guiding principles listed along the bottom, which Governor Hochul and DEC we've been directed, Governor Hochul required and directed DEC and NYSERDA to follow. So next slide. So now we're going to get into the background of where we are on the investments side of this. And I'm going to pass this to Ansela, and she's going to cover that portion of the presentation. Ansela?
Thank you, Alana. Next slide. So in the fiscal year of 2024 state budget, Governor Hochul and the legislature established a climate action fund, which is where the proceeds from the sale of the allowances at the NYCI auctions will be deposited and allocated into 3 accounts on this slide. The first account is the Consumer Climate Action Account, which will deliver at least 30% of future NYCI proceeds to New Yorkers every year to mitigate potential consumer costs. The Climate Affordability Study, which was released last year with the pre-proposal outline, provides recommendations on the delivery mechanism for these funds and is available at capandinvest.ny.gov. An Industrial Small Business Climate Action Account will direct up to 3% of proceeds to support energy affordability for industrial small business in New York. And then the remaining 67% of future allowance proceeds will fund a climate investment account, which is the focus of today's webinar. Next slide, please. In addition to supporting administrative and technical costs for the running of the NYCI program, the Climate Investment Account will support the transition to a less carbon-intensive economy. The statutory language creating this fund states that funds from this account should be used to invest in activities recommended in the scoping plan, such as energy efficiency and electrification, workforce development, and increasing the capacity of communities to engage in climate mitigation efforts. In particular, at least 35% of investments with a goal of 40% or more will be designed to provide benefits to disadvantaged communities. Climate Action Fund law puts emphasis on early actions to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in disadvantaged communities. For example, NYCI could fund efforts like the mitigation strategies being developed in partnership with the communities and DEC's Community Air Monitoring Program, which is working with residents of 10 disadvantaged communities to identify hyper-local sources of air pollution and develop solutions to them. And as these projects are tested and refined, they should be replicated statewide. The allocation of funds in the Climate Investment Account will ultimately be decided through the state budget process. The intention of this webinar and the request for feedback is so the governor and the legislature have the benefit of public input as they develop next year's state budget. The use of proceeds is separate from the development of the regulations that will guide the NYCI program. Next slide. So here we've laid out our process for seeking public input on the use of NYCI proceeds under the Climate Investment Account. Today, we'll share a draft framework for investments and launch a comment intake to collect initial public input on the use of proceeds with an emphasis on ways to benefit disadvantaged communities. State agencies will also assess that input and develop investment proposals, which will be considered for inclusion in the governor's executive budget proposal. NYCI funds are best managed through a planning process with a multi-year time horizon so that there will be future opportunities to provide input on the use of proceeds in the Climate Investment Account. Next slide, please. So though we have initiated a process dedicated to gathering public input on the funds from the Climate Investment Account, we've heard from many New Yorkers on this topic already. And as part of an extensive NYCI pre-proposal outreach, DEC and NYSERDA have been undertaking since 2023 on the development of the NYCI regulations. We've received thousands of comments that touched on the use of proceeds and how to consider equity and affordability in the program. Although we welcome feedback on the use of proceeds during the pre-proposal outreach, use of proceeds will not be covered in the regulations under development. This feedback was received from across a range of stakeholders, including advocacy groups, trade associations, labor unions, businesses, and others listed on this slide. The next couple of slides will summarize the main themes from the comments received to date. And so this is to provide some context for the draft framework and potential areas for investment to be presented later in this webinar. Next slide, please. The first theme from these early comments was that NYCI investments should advance the deployment of technology that will help sectors decarbonize and reduce emissions. This includes electrifying the transportation sector by investing in electric vehicles and fleets and supporting charging infrastructure, as well as enhancing and upgrading public transportation, especially in areas serving disadvantaged communities. Decarbonizing residential and commercial buildings, including investments that support health and safety and the retrofit readiness upgrades, was also a common theme in comments. Another was assisting industry to decarbonize through incentives and investments in research, development, and demonstration for new technologies was also recognized, as was the need for grid infrastructure investments that support reliability and resiliency. The second theme focused on supporting a clean energy workforce by prioritizing investments that guarantee strong labor protections through labor peace agreements, prevailing wage agreements, and the use of pre-apprenticeship and apprenticeship programs. These comments also spoke to investments in workforce development, training, along with wraparound services, as well as support for transitioning workers. And finally, the importance of prioritizing affordability for consumers, business, and industry was top of mind amongst commenters. Next slide, please. Many comments we received spoke about challenges faced by members of disadvantaged communities and offered suggestions for how NYCI funds could be invested to provide benefits. Specific challenges in disadvantaged communities that commenters highlighted included air quality impacts, which have a direct impact on public health. They noted residents in disadvantaged communities are also particularly vulnerable to increases in energy costs or related expenses. Additionally, comments spoke to structural and functional barriers that members of disadvantaged communities face when pursuing energy upgrades. Examples of these include difficulty accessing capital, split incentives between renters, and health and safety improvements that are needed in housing before doing weatherization or electrification projects. In response to these challenges, commenters suggested that NYCI proceeds could be invested to support energy affordability programs, offer targeted funding in disadvantaged communities for clean energy deployment in buildings, transportation, and renewable energy, and support accelerated workforce development and training in disadvantaged communities. Next slide. Now I'd like to introduce Vanessa Ulmer, Assistant Policy Director at NYSERDA, who will walk through a proposed draft investment framework and associated areas for investment from NYCI.
Thanks, Angela. So I'm pleased to walk through a draft proposal which DEC and NYSERDA staff developed to guide the use of future NYCI proceeds from the Climate Investment Account. This proposal is directly informed by New York's scoping plan, and in turn by all of the meaningful stakeholder engagement that went into that scoping plan process. Specific to NYCI, we also appreciate the initial comments on the use of proceeds that Angela just spoke to, and we sincerely invite additional public input on this topic. The draft proposal being shared today is designed to be consistent with the 5 core principles that Governor Hochul set forth for the Cap and Invest program. With respect to affordability, the Consumer Climate Action Account, which you heard about earlier, will deliver at least 30% of future cap and investment proceeds to New Yorkers every year to mitigate consumer costs. We can also think about how the Climate Investment Account can reinforce affordability as a principle and goal. In terms of climate leadership, the NYCI program will be designed with the capacity to link with other current or future programs to further catalyze a nationwide movement towards carbon pricing, which can lower the price of the clean energy transition overall. Creating jobs and preserving competitiveness as a principle notes that the program will launch new investment in industries that will create tens of thousands of good paying and family sustaining jobs that can lift up entire communities. As you've heard, investing in disadvantaged communities is a key principle and the Cap and Invest program will prioritize the frontline disadvantaged communities in our state that for far too long have suffered from pollution and environmental injustice. And finally, in terms of funding a sustainable future, the climate investment account that we are discussing today will direct 2/3 of future Cap and Invest proceeds to support the transition to a less carbon-intensive economy. Next slide, please. So consistent with these guiding principles that the NYCI program is being designed to deliver on, DEC and NYSERDA have developed a draft investment framework. The framework outlines a set of guiding priorities for how proceeds from the climate investment account will be invested. This investment framework in turn informs how the state, with feedback from the public, will identify the areas that will receive NYCI investments. These areas may be sectors of the economy which directly contribute to emissions reduction, and they also can be cross-sectoral areas that help advance Climate Act goals, such as workforce development and a just transition, or community-directed initiatives in disadvantaged communities. Next slide, please. So I'll now go through the proposed investment framework. On the left of the slide are Governor Hochul's guiding principles for NYCI, which I just spoke to. And on the right are the corresponding elements of the proposed investment framework. With future funds from the climate investment account, New York would make investments that reduce greenhouse gas emissions and co-pollutants and that sequester carbon to advance progress toward the state's climate goals. In order to support ambitious clean energy investment, the state would also place emphasis on catalyzing private investment that leverages public dollars. And relatedly, state investments would support innovation, especially in sectors that are harder to decarbonize today, in order to help expand the set of choices that are attractive to customers. A guiding principle for NYCI and a guiding principle in this proposed framework is to make investments that advance equity and climate justice, improve air quality and health, and drive overall benefits to disadvantaged communities. In doing this, we will ensure that at least 35% with a goal of 40% of investments benefit disadvantaged communities. Another priority is to support energy affordability and help reduce the cost of the energy transition by investing in energy efficiency and other clean energy technologies. As we're making these investments, New York State is focused on creating family-sustaining jobs and supporting economic development. And NYCI and the Climate Investment Account can help advance this with direct funding for worker development and other worker and community support to advance a just transition. Finally, the proposed investment framework points to the importance of using some NYCI proceeds to conduct policy-relevant research and program evaluation tied to emissions-reducing projects. Next slide, please. Next, I'll speak to 6 sectoral areas and 3 cross-sectoral areas that are proposed to receive funds from the Climate Investment Account. The first area that's being proposed for investment is clean transportation, transit, and mobility. Within this area, NYCI funds could invest in zero-emissions vehicles and non-road equipment, including EV charging and hydrogen filling stations. The DEC and NYSERDA further propose an emphasis on medium and heavy-duty vehicles and equipment, such as ports and logistic operations, since these sources have disproportionate impacts on air quality in disadvantaged communities. For example, NYCI funds could support municipal and school bus electrification in disadvantaged communities. This investment area would also encompass investments in public transit and other infrastructure to improve and encourage green mobility and smart growth. The second proposed investment area, shown here, is electric grid modernization. This includes innovation that supports the research, development, and demonstration of emerging technologies that would help us to maintain grid reliability and resiliency. Next slide, please. Third, NYCI investments are proposed to support upgrades in low-carbon residential and commercial buildings. This is envisioned to include funding for modernizing safe, healthy, and affordable housing through investments in weatherization, heat pumps, and energy-related health and safety upgrades, especially in public and affordable housing. It could also include support for electrification and thermal efficiency upgrades in commercial and public or institutional buildings, with an emphasis on buildings located in disadvantaged communities. Fourth, low-carbon industry is proposed as a sector for NYCI investments. Here, NYCI funds could help demonstrate replicable models for industrial decarbonization through energy efficiency, electrification, and alternative fuels and feedstocks while delivering benefits to disadvantaged communities. Next slide, please. The fifth sectoral area proposed for investment is agriculture and forestry. This includes investments to help sequester carbon. NYCI could fund things like protecting open space, planting trees, and restoring wetlands. This area could include climate investments to support agricultural lands and sustainable practices, such as by providing funds to historically underrepresented farmers to help them to adopt improved soil and nutrient management practices. And then the sixth proposed sectoral investment area is waste. Here, NYCI funds could be directed towards benefits for disadvantaged communities by funding expanded organics recycling in these areas. This area would also capture gas capture and monitoring at landfills, actions to reduce fugitive methane at landfills and waste treatment facilities, and improve refrigerant disposal. Next slide, please. DEC and NYSERDA staff are also proposing 3 cross-sectoral areas that the climate investment account could invest in. These cross-sectoral areas enable emissions reductions across the sectors we just discussed and help advance the equity and economic development goals of NYCI and the state's Climate Act. The first of these areas is investing in workforce development and a just transition. Here, the Office of Just Energy Transition within the state's Department of Labor is expected to play a key role in coordinating such investments. Investments could include direct funding and financial incentives toward workforce development and training programs. They also could fund support for a just transition for new and existing workers and for communities. The second cross-sectoral investment area is focused on supporting economic development, including a focus on growing in-state manufacturing and supply chains and innovation ecosystems for clean energy technologies. Regional and local economic development authorities, such as regional economic development councils, could help inform investments in this area by identifying sites in disadvantaged communities and other communities with strong potential for revitalization. This brings us to the final investment area that's being proposed as a cross-sectoral area. Community decision-making and stakeholder input is an area of emphasis, as you hear us say repeatedly today, for both the scoping plan and the investment of NYCI proceeds. The climate investment account could allocate dedicated funding for emissions-reducing projects that meet local needs in disadvantaged communities, where the specific projects are identified through community decision-making and input. These community-directed projects are envisioned to complement and to leverage other NYCI investments and to be paired with capacity building. In sum, DEC and NYSERDA staff developed a draft framework and investment areas to guide how future NYCI proceeds can be directed to support the equitable transition to a low-carbon economy. We now look forward to your input. With that, please advance to the next slide, and I'll pass it back to Alana to start the discussion with our panel.
Thank you, Vanessa. So as a reminder, the focus of our discussion today is input on the use of the NYCI proceeds from the climate investment account, which is separate from the development of the regulations. DEC and NYSERDA will still be welcoming feedback on the regulation development through the established channels for submitting your thoughts and ideas on that particular aspect of the program. So your comments are welcome on any of the aspects of the investments. We have organized the request for feedback around 4 core topics: the investment framework, the investment areas, types of activities best suited for NYCI investments, and the planning process. Ansel and I are going to pose a series of questions for each of those topic areas to the panelists so we can hear your feedback and your perspectives on these topics. And I'll ask panelists to raise their hand or use the hand raise function to let us know if you would like to speak. Next slide, please. And so as we've indicated earlier in this webinar, this is just the beginning of an ongoing planning process for these investments. So if you have feedback on how we should approach this process, we'd love to hear it. Some questions to consider: offering feedback on what kind of structures and processes should New York employ to ensure stakeholder participation and the effective investment of these funds. What kind of structures and processes should New York State employ to offer increased certainty to market actors and program administrators? Finally, as we've discussed today, the scoping plan and legislative direction for the use of NYCI proceeds places and particular emphasis on community decision-making and stakeholder input for investments that prioritize disadvantaged communities. So this includes early action to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and co-pollutants in these disadvantaged communities. So for community-directed investments in disadvantaged communities specifically, DEC and NYSERDA, we're looking to hear from you on what is the appropriate scale that enables a critical mass of funding and adequate administrative efficiency to effectively spend these proceeds. Next slide. And I'll turn over to Ansela.
So the next topic for input is the investment areas. Which are those sectoral and cross-sectoral areas that Vanessa explained? We'd like to know which of these you see as most critical for the climate investment account to fund. And when responding to this question, please consider addressing the following. How might you rank the investment areas? What factors should inform how the state is prioritizing the investment areas? And are there investment areas that New York State should consider that, while already addressed via regulations or other mechanisms, would still benefit from NYCI funding investments to ensure accelerate achievement to secure other benefits? Next slide. And then overall, what interventions do you see as critical to receive investment of NYCI proceeds through the climate investment account? So what funding needs do you see existing today that seem appropriate for NYCI? How should New York State consider costs relative to associated impacts and benefits? And for example, should New York State orient investments toward lower cost opportunities that produce faster emissions reductions, or more difficult and or expensive areas where emission reductions might otherwise not be achieved or achieved more slowly? And then also, how should New York State balance funding for mass deployment of market-ready clean energy technologies versus innovation to address the cost, feasibility, and access barriers for emerging solutions? Alana?
Thank you, Ansela. And we'll round it out with a discussion on the draft investment framework. We're really interested in whether you have any feedback to share on this draft to refine how we guide the use of proceeds from the climate investment account. Sorry, next slide. Okay, so now we're going to go into an intermission. We've been receiving some questions throughout the webinar, and we're going to take a short break and return in around 3 minutes. So we're looking at actually we'll say 1:42 because I'm still talking, for a question and answer session. So please continue to answer your questions into the Q&A feature, and we're going to do our best to answer as many questions as we possibly can when we come back. All right, we'll see folks at 1:42. Okay, it is 1:42. If we could start to gather and return. And I will turn things over to Samir Ranaday. Samir?
Hey, Alana. Good afternoon, everyone. Let's go ahead and go into the questions, but I'm actually going to go ahead and pass it over to Ansela. Just wait, Ansela, could you confirm? Great.
Yes. So I think now we are going to start the panel discussion, and we are going to start on the feedback on the planning process. And so our panelists are ready to answer these questions. Some of the questions that to consider on offering feedback are: what kind of structures and processes should New York State employ to ensure stakeholder participation in the effective investment of these funds? And then what kind of structures and processes should New York State employ to offer to increase certainty, market sectors, and program administrators? So as we discussed, if you would like to provide an answer to those questions, please use the raise your hand function. Gloria?
Okay, good afternoon, and thank you so much for including me in this discussion today. I'm Gloria Boyce Charles. Just a little bit by way of understanding who I am a community advocate in the Brookville community out in Queens, New York. And I have been a resident here for many years, 25 plus years, and you know, do talk with our community leaders and with our residents, and have been engaged in a lot of the civic activity here. So as I speak about these things, I'm not an expert on climate. I'm not, you know, a technician, but I've been engaged. And I think one of the things that I've been finding in EJ, you know, sensitive environment we've reached these days is that it's overwhelming, isn't it? I mean, there is much going on, many opportunities for EJ communities to look at the burdens that they face and to address them. And some of the key people who would help to make these things happen and implement them are people in our communities, our community-based organizations, our residents, yes, our small businesses, our community boards, and they need to be engaged in a structured and systematic way so that they can take advantage of these opportunities. And that's something that I've seen, and I don't mean to be overly critical, you know, I've seen lacking overall. I mean, there are many city agencies that are engaged in these processes now. Are they talking to one another? State agencies, are they talking to city agencies? Are they talking to CBOs? And how are we reaching the people? If a great portion of the carbon emissions are coming out of our residential and commercial buildings, how are we engaging people at the residential levels, renters, homeowners, to make them aware of the issues, to help them to care about the issues, to help them to know what benefits are out there and what they can do to mitigate and to green their homes. So with that in mind, you know, I look at a couple of things, and I won't take too much more time. I think we'll talk more as we go along, but you know, we have our energy hubs, and I love them. We have a Queens Energy Hub, and it's absolutely a brilliant concept. But the capacity of those hubs to reach into our communities and to actually get to the 2 million, the over 2 million people in Queens, and the over 830 plus households in Queens, to help them to take advantage of these things and to understand the importance of these things. How do they do that unless they have capacity? So I would say working with the energy hubs to increase their capacity, working with the energy hubs to reach out more intentionally to the community boards, for example. There are 14 in Queens, maybe having a couple of community boards that are assigned to each of the hub staff members, and the hub member reaching out to that community board to learn more about the CBOs in those communities, to learn more about the issues of the residents in those communities, and then making that connection with them, outreaching to them, bringing them together to talk about solutions, issues and solutions, and marketing strategies for getting people involved. And I can share some examples of where I've seen some of this work, but I'd like to give others a chance to opine.
Thank you, Gloria. Eunice, Monique, Eric, anything addition? Monique, and then Eric.
Yeah, thank you, Angela, and thank you, Gloria, for your words. I think most of what you were saying is the direction in which my comments were going to go. So I'm glad we're starting with the planning processes as the first question, because we do need a proper plan to be able to, like Gloria said, reach the community members that we so desperately need to reach, those who are not in the weeds of all of this planning and even the climate law in itself. So, and also I do agree with the buildings being the most emissions, and also the place where people are, right? They live at home, they need their homes to be safe and secure. And so to focus on building decarbonization is key in all of this. When we think about other things that we are also focusing on in the state, regarding like extreme heat, making sure that someone's home is comfortable and that they're not going to face danger in an extreme heat event has to be prioritized. So we check a lot of boxes when we do this, building decarbonization, and also reach the people who are renting. That is a really high concern, that every time we talk about this, that we don't have a plan for renters. I don't see that plan yet. So we have to start thinking that way and engaging people to make sure that they are part of the process. And yeah, the clean energy hubs, we have 10 of them in the state, and they need more resources to drill down and really be on the ground. So between them and our community-based organizations, these are ways that we can really touch everyone that we need to touch, and plan from like a renter's perspective, right? People who live in disadvantaged communities perspective, not from a programmatic perspective or from a statewide or administrative level. We need to speak to what people need in their homes, and not what would be easiest to kind of administrate. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you, Monique, for that response. Eric?
I'll try and be brief here, but I think, to answer the first top line question on the slide, what structures and processes should be employed to maybe create stakeholder participation in the use of funds? And I think this, to Monique's point, and to maybe Gloria's point as well, is like, I'm very much a big proponent of using the lens of felt impact, and felt impact is a term that is meant to kind of describe the visibility and perception of the value of a given intervention or investment in the community to like discern its value, right? So health and safety remediation and housing is something that's very kind of clearly part of how people understand the improvements in the quality of their housing and the quality of their life, right? We know anecdotally and empirically that home comfort drives particularly LMI household action around energy efficiency, for example, and energy efficiency is the #1 way to drive bill reduction in people's energy consumption, right? Like, no argument there. So the use of the lens of felt impact is really a key kind of primary way in which you can use to understand how to structure the notion of investment in any of the sectors or cross-sectoral investment focus areas that have been named in the proposal that have been proposed so far. The second thing I want to talk about is structure, right? So I'm also a big fan of the California Transformative Climate Communities Program, which uses a framework for shared and collaborative decision making as for grant recipients, particularly in their planning and implementation grants. And so those are set up on a kind of in a similar model to the EPA's collaborative problem solving grant framework. And so that's a very clear structure for how you create multi-stakeholder partnerships and how you manage power dynamics within those multi-stakeholder partnerships and collaboratives, and how you use that multi-stakeholder collaborative or partnership to execute work that's outlined in the project, right? That's a structure. A process that you could use for I'm not going to tell you how to do your job, Anzalo, or the folks at DEC, but I imagine that there's a way in which you can ground the convening of these kinds of partnerships, create some documents that outline, who's in the table, how power will be shared, or decision-making power will be shared within those collaborations, and then how you want to evaluate the performance of work based on the collaborative problem-solving agreement, right? That would be useful to measure project progress over the long run, particularly if you're going to make those multi-year funding resources, because we know that it takes time to both get collaboratives off the ground, get work done, and then do the evaluation on the back end.
Thank you for those recommendations, Eric. Can you do us a favor, and all panelists just reintroduce yourselves upon your next answer? Thank you. Eunice?
Yes, thank you. Yeah, my name is Eunice Ko. I'm with the New York City Environmental Justice Alliance. Just like a quick intro on who we are, just so people understand our perspective and where we're coming from. We are an environmental justice nonprofit organization that was founded in 1991, linking the most environmentally burdened, primarily low-income Black and Brown communities across New York City. We have members across the different 5 boroughs, from Hunts Point in the Bronx to North Shore, Staten Island to Sunset Park in Brooklyn, just to name a few. But yes, through our members, we work together in our fight for environmental justice. So yeah, just some quick thoughts on this planning process question. I think maybe just 3 main points here, and plus support and affirm everything my fellow panelists have already stated. But yeah, I think one thing to note here is, recognizing this is going to be year by year, like funding that we'll get through the Cap, Trade, and Invest program. Really believe that it's important that it be a multi-year planning process, though. We can anticipate, more emission reductions, also more revenue throughout the years. And so we think it's important that in order for it not to become like a random grab bag list of different programs and projects,
that kind of get rushed through the budget session, really want to make sure that that is grounded in, again, like a multi-year process that's thoughtful in sequencing, in strategy, and prioritization, really keeping it in mind, again, Section 7.3 and the priority here being disadvantaged communities who've had historically suffered from air pollution, sickness, and death. The second point being mass deployment of solutions at our disposal now. We know that there are things available in the market, technologies that are here today that we know will work. By work, I mean will reduce our emissions, our co-pollutant emissions, improve our health, and can in the long run be cost effective. And so, yeah, I think it's important that we deploy those strategies now instead of waiting for some perfect emerging technology when we know full electrification full electrification is the most beneficial. And the last point, and I think the other panelists have said this, but yes, totally agree on using existing groups such as the Clean Energy Hub, such as the Climate Justice Working Group, but also acknowledge needing to go deeper to communities. And I think like an integral part of that is just making this accessible to people. You know, we hear a lot of fear mongering right now. The transition is too expensive. It's going to hurt the New Yorker. Not helpful messaging, again, when we are trying to convince people that these investments not only will help improve the environment, help us prevent maybe some frequent climate disasters, but also just improve quality of life. Students don't learn as well when it's hot. There's actual research that shows student performance goes down. So when we think about heat, flooding, all of these things are going to impact just the way people just live and experience and go about their daily lives. And so that impact and those benefits need to be clearly articulated and, again, accessible. And while super appreciate these forums, they're amazing and a great way to, I think, collect some public impact, some input. This like slide deck would not be understandable to even like, it would not be understandable to most New Yorkers. And so, would encourage just making this, again, more real and tangible for New Yorkers, because we know that there are real benefits for all New Yorkers here.
Thank you, Eunice. Gloria. You're muted, Gloria.
Thank you. I'd like to just follow up on that a little bit. You know, planning comes at various levels, doesn't it? I mean, there's the planning that's going on at the agency level, state and city, and who is engaged in that. Eunice, you mentioned the Climate Justice Working Group. Queens is the largest in terms of landmass borough in New York City. It's the second most populous borough with over 2 million people in it and over 830 households. And there is a climate justice working group that where Queens has no voice. And so we haven't been shy about saying that, but the inclusion of as many environmental justice communities and our boroughs in the conversations and the decisions that are being made at those higher levels is critical. It's absolutely essential. There's an environmental justice advisory board that's supposed to be in place, that's supposed to consult and help us to make just and fair, inclusive decisions, and that hasn't been convened. So we need to look at that. But then there's the implementation. And even before there is the collaboration. City agencies are doing things, state agencies are doing things, communities are doing things. The federal government is doing stuff. So I'd say federal, state, and city especially. How are we collaborating at those levels to make sure that we've acknowledged, we've seen gaps, and to make sure that we're not being redundant? And God knows we haven't made sure that we haven't overwhelmed people, because we have. People are overwhelmed. So developing structures for working in these different levels of program design and development, I think is so important. And then you get to the community-based, the community level. Like I was saying earlier, the community boards in New York City, at least, the community boards and connecting to the community-based organizations and the civic associations and working into the communities so that you can have that grassroots impact that's going to get a real big bang for your buck. And so I'm just saying that we've got to look at program design at those different levels and make sure that we're being fair in the way that we're structuring our programs and make sure that we're being inclusive. So those are some of the comments I just would have to follow up. I want to mention, I mentioned earlier that there was a program that I'd like to highlight. It was administered by the Office of Racial Justice, I believe, and I don't know if any of you remember it. It was the midterm election 2022, and they had a campaign called Flip the Ballot because they had 3 propositions that they wanted New Yorkers to vote on, plus the Environmental Bond Act, but that wasn't part of their mission. And they were on the back of the ballot, and people don't read the back of the ballot. They don't know in advance before they go into the polls what's on the ballot. So this initiative was to inform people about what was on the back of the ballot and to encourage them to go out and make sure they flip the ballot and vote however they wanted to. And in order to implement this and reach the most people, they had a really innovative structured program. They gathered the CBOs, they incentivized them with a budget. They asked for specific plans about how they were going to reach the most people, how many people they were going to reach, what kind of events they were going to hold these people over a specified time frame. They asked for documentation, sign-in sheets, pictures of events that they held, and other kind and incentives, actual monetary incentives to these organizations because they need that. And they provided assets. They provided little cue cards with highlights of important points that people at grassroots levels could understand and hold on to. All of these things combined and more really helped to boost the participation in that voting activity. And I'm suggesting that's a great model for reaching grassroots in something as critical as this over time. And it builds capacity in our organizations as well.
Thank you for your comment, Gloria. Monique and then Eric.
Yeah, I just wanted to come back around because one of the things that I didn't say when I first talked and I didn't introduce myself. So I'm Monique Fitzgerald. My pronouns are she and her. I'm the climate justice organizer at the Long Island Progressive Coalition. I've been with the Long Island Progressive Coalition for about 3 years now, and the Long Island Progressive Coalition is an organization that has been established since 1979, so we've been around for a little bit of time. And so, you know, we kind of try to do our best to cover Long Island as best as we can to make sure that people who are not necessarily joining these types of conversations have a place to kind of voice their challenges and seek structural changes. So I will say that. And then, you know, Gloria is very insightful and kind of sparked my my memory of what I also wanted to add here, which was benefits, right? So we definitely want investments in disadvantaged communities, but we also want to see that our people who are living in disadvantaged communities need to see that they are gaining a great benefit from the work that we are doing. And so that tangible thing that folks were talking about is what I believe that I'm getting at here. we have to think of ways that community members and communities at large can build community wealth and community ownership through these processes. And when we do look to invest in the community, we do have the climate law that says at least 35% with a goal of 40, but I think we need to really think about exceeding that 40% investment way beyond that 40%, as that is just the floor of investment. So what are the tangible ways that we can benefit someone's life that they will also be on board and kind of help share this information with their neighbors, their friends, their family? Because no matter what technology has come to be, where we have social media and all these other things that we get word out, nothing beats word of mouth. So once we really make a strong and positive impact in someone's life, we will be able to have them as proponent to kind of share this message and get their neighbors on to do the same. So it'll build the culture of a just transition, not just kind of placing it upon someone. So yeah, I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you, Monique. Eric.
All right, I'll try and be brief here. I'll reintroduce myself as you requested, Angela. So, hi everyone, Eric Walker. We act for environmental justice. I work on energy justice policy, but I've had a long run both in local government, state government, and community-based organizations working on energy efficiency and energy development for a long time. I just want to kind of quickly say that I think one thing that's really important here is that the state, right, particularly this combination of DEC and NYSERDA, who have been leading the Climate Action Council and a lot of the climate-related work, already have some great foundational insights and guidance on how to begin to develop some frameworks building off of the comments here. And I don't want that to get lost in the way that we move through answering questions that are here on the slide in front of us. So, for example, the Disadvantaged Communities Barriers and Opportunities report from the end of 2021 was a really kind of foundational document in thinking about how to conceptualize both the barriers that disadvantaged communities face accessing programs and, to Monique's point, benefits from clean energy investments that were ongoing in the state already, and create some really clear opportunities and recommendations for how to move beyond those barriers. And so that's a great place to start in thinking about using internal insights as well as the insights from folks on this panel and other places to support developing a systemic way of addressing stakeholder participation. The second thing I want to quickly say is that the resources that are put into stakeholder engagement from the state are like not nearly enough, right? The $50 million that are going into the clean energy hubs, while novel for the state, are not significant enough, right? There's 13 different organizations around this, constellations of organizations around the states that are having to get to, tens of millions of people. That's just not enough money, right? And so if we're really serious about getting into the weeds, I guess it's really a question of how deep you want to go into kind of capturing the sentiment of communities across the state. If we want to get down to the ground, then we really have to invest, I think, a lot more time and effort into cultivating trust and cultivating opportunities for real conversation and dialogue in accessible ways, so that we have, one, a clear notion of the sentiment in relationship to all the things that the documents you've already created, right? The Barriers Opportunities Report, for example. And then two, not just the sentiment, but then take that back into process. One thing that the state's really good at is process, And so I think if we want to get down to the ground and understand what communities are really thinking about, we need more robust resources for doing that, some of which could be thought about through the Cap and Invest program, but some of which could really build off of what we've done already in order to get to a place where we're hearing robustly from all corners of the state. And that's not just within the context of disadvantaged communities, because we know that map isn't perfect and it's going to continue to get updated over the years, but really at every corner of the state, because we have communities that are just not really feeling heard, whether those are rural communities in the North Country or in the Southern Tier or Central New York, or really, quite frankly, in the footprint of the hubs where they just don't have, in my opinion, the capacity to reach every corner of the service territory that they've taken control of.
Thank you, Eric. So we're going to move to the next question. Thank you so much for your comments on the process, and I will pass it to Alana.
Sorry. Let's go. Couldn't find my mute button. Just moving some things around my screen. All right. Okay. So we are on the next question, where is, I guess, overall. Sorry. There we go. Like, this doesn't feel the question's like getting cut off by my screen. My screen is too small for the rest of this entire thing. But it says overall, what interventions do you see as critical to receive investments through the investment of NYCI proceeds through the climate investment account? So basically, what funding needs do you see existing today that are appropriate for NYCI? How should we consider the costs relative to the associated impacts and benefits? As you see here, for example, how should we orient these investments towards lower cost opportunities that produce faster emissions? And how should we balance the funding for mass deployment of market-ready clean energy technology versus innovation to address the costs, feasibility, and access barriers for emerging solutions? Eunice, I see you have your hand up.
Yes, thank you. I think this might touch on the response just in, like, you ask about how they should think about investment areas. I still think there is a funding need for more healthy, resilient, and affordable housing that promotes structural repairs and retrofits, hazard remediation, and efficiency and electrification. It's not a surprise to any of us that hazardous conditions found in unsafe housing can lead to lead poisoning, asthma, other health issues like cancer, unintentional injuries, death. This can result in bigger outcomes like poor school attendance and performance for children, mixed workday for parents, and loss of loved ones. In New York in particular, just want to give a few stats in terms of what housing and the substandard housing means for some people. In New York, 30% of children live in households with a high housing cost burden, and 19% of children live in poverty. This was the 2021 statistic, so it might be even higher now. 76% of New York housing was built prior to 1978 and many contain lead-based paint, 30% built before 1940. This is the last stat. About 9,000 students New York's children have tested for an elevated blood test level. Again, this was a few years ago, so numbers may be higher. And I think the point here is to say our housing right now currently in New York State is making people sick. It's not providing heating, cooling efficiently, and is just not safe in some cases. According to the scoping plan, New York's residential commercial building sectors encompasses about 6 million buildings, which are home to about 7.4 million households. So the scale is huge, the need is big. And about nearly half of those households statewide are low to moderate income households, which I think underscores the importance here of housing and energy affordability. The scoping plan also states that switching from fossil fuels to heat pumps for heating and hot water will immediately and significantly reduce greenhouse gas emissions and criteria pollutants from buildings. As modeled in the integration analysis scenario, widespread improvements to building envelopes will reduce energy demand from the building sectors by 30 to 50% by 2050. So that's all just to say, describe the scale, the need, and the immense benefits that the scoping plan found from just building electrification, but also doing that pre-weatherization work as well. So there is a need for, again, this healthy, resilient, and affordable housing. We have to think about, I think, these types of programs as like whole house programs and structure them equitably so people aren't left out because they have complicated housing intervention needs. A lot of communities still need investments in their housing, and these burdens are obviously higher in low-income communities, communities of color, rental households that have structural barriers in participating in these programs. Existing programs, for example, New York Clean Heat, Empire Plus. So we really need a comprehensive model that's going to reach low-income communities and communities of color. And that still, I believe, is a need. And so if we can think about these kind of like whole house program model, we can then think about integrating health, safety, energy efficiency, electrification, decarbonization, and the housing repair services that are needed and are tailored to community and household needs. Also want to add like the potential for major savings and benefits to New Yorkers here, particularly low-income communities of color. According to a study published early this year, if every household got a heat pump, residential building emissions would fall 36 to 64%. Again, this is national, but I think, yeah, we'll get to my point here. This national investment would require $1.2 trillion to ensure every household has a heat pump. But it would pay for it. The study found that it would pay for itself by slashing utility bills, healthcare costs, and also avoid the economic damage caused by climate pollution. So with all that considered, the modeling found that heat pumps would save $448 billion over a 15-year lifetime of appliances, prevent economic damage from the burning of fossil fuels, energy serving $470 billion, and avoided health costs, I think $315 billion in health costs over the 15 years. So I won't keep yammering on with statistics, but I think the point here is that we keep hearing that these investments will be costly, that they're expensive. And while this is true, the research also shows the benefits are immense. And so when we're also thinking about the funding and the investments, what costs to calculate, we need to be calculating these avoided costs, the avoided costs from someone having to go to the emergency room because of an asthma attack. These are the kind of costs that need to be baked into how we think about these investments and the benefits as well. And so if we do that, these costs won't seem so scary. We can make low to moderate income households whole. And that's what we need to be kind of talking and focusing our energies on. And so yeah, that's all. Sorry, I'll just stop there. But that's to say, like, yeah, there is an immense need, I think, for a residential building electrification and all the work it would take in order for us to do that. And there are huge health cost benefits for all New Yorkers, but particularly communities of color and low-income communities.
Thank you, Eunice. Gloria.
Eunice, such good points you made. I think that one of the things that, and I think I'm going to answer two questions at the same time. I'm sorry, I don't know if I can avoid it. But we really do need to understand that we're probably talking about expensive solutions. But what you're saying, Eunice, is so right, that on the other side of this, we're saving money too. Medical and healthcare is going to be, is going to be, those costs are going to be defrayed by the fact that, we have healthier homes to live in. But I hope it also makes us, I hope it also informs, and I know this is not about the regulations, the NYCI regulations, but I hope it also informs the way those regulations are finalized in order to maximize the proceeds that are coming from these, these corporate fuel emission sources. We want to maximize those investment proceeds through the regulatory program, and we want to do everything we can to create a healthy environment, and that means reaching those 2030 and 2050 carbon reduction goals. So I think, Eunice, you bring out points that really support some of those thoughts. If I think about Southeast Queens and Queens, I think nobody who knows me would expect me to say otherwise, and it is that what's missing, and that's what I'm saying, I'm probably answering another question too. What's missing here is a discussion about the airport and the airplane noise and air pollution. And I do think that there's need to be some appropriate interventions for researching the presence of air pollutants and the impact of those pollutants on our health and on our schools and in our homes. And I think that it needs to go further to say, you know, these are some interventions that need to be put into place. And so again, lots of money, but at the end of the day, maybe we save a lot in terms of adding to our health and quality of life. And I'll talk more about that in the next question, I think. You know, I'll just say this, that Southeast Queens in particular, because that's where I live and I know best, but Queens, you know, we have two major airports in the borough. One is an international airport. The fumes and the emissions that come from the airplane jet fuel, they're really not included in consideration in any of these programs that we're talking about today. But what's encouraging here is that there seem to be some opportunities in here for looking ahead at the importance of these emissions. Where are they? How intensive are they in particular communities? What communities are being impacted, and what can we do about it? So I'm hopeful. At the same time as I'm bringing up these things, I'm hopeful that we see some opportunity to address some of these issues. There are more, but I'll save it for the next question. Thank you.
Thank you, Gloria. Monique.
Yeah, I'm gonna keep it short. I think, you know, I really love and appreciate what Eunice shared in the beginning. So it kind of really set us up to have a full answer for this question. But I do want to say, just on the fact of, or the question of, what interventions do you see as critical, right? And I know the question is a little longer than that, but critical is where I want to stop for right now, is because we have to get these programs initiated. We are being too lackadaisical about when we're going to get these programs deployed and how we're going to get these things online. And like Eric said, you know, our agencies are good at process, but implementation has to be like number one. Like, we have to get these programs going so that folks can feel the impact and get the positive results that we need in their lives and as a state as a whole, and being a part of this, you know, global society, right? So I think there has to be a real eye to urgency with this, and then also when we're talking about investments, and again, we are staying on the investment side today, but I can't help but to just throw a nod to the cap side or the regulation side of this, is that what a lot of our communities need, and I hear Gloria saying, is that we have these polluting infrastructures that need to start to be held accountable. And part of that is not only just the money that we retrieve from them, but it is also in lowering their emissions. But we have to kind of put a focus on getting these facilities and things offline. So we have to invest in our communities that way, not just only like in the actual dollar amount that we're spending. So caps, maximize our caps, and maximize our process to offboard these polluting infrastructures. Thank you.
Thank you, Monique. Did anybody else have any input or any answers before we move on? All right. And with that, I will throw it to you, Angela.
Thank you, Alana. So the next topic for input is the investment areas. which are those sectoral and cross-sectoral areas that Vanessa explained. So we'd like to know which of these you see as most critical for the climate investment account to fund. So in thinking about this question again, how might you rank the proposed investment areas? What factors should inform how the state thinks about prioritizing the investment areas? Are there areas, investment areas that New York should consider that, while already addressed via regulation or other mechanisms, would still benefit from New York Cap and Invest funded investments to ensure or accelerate achievement or to secure other benefits? So I know it's a multi-pronged question. The proposed investment areas, again, are listed: clean transportation, transit, mobility.
I'll just jump in here.
Thanks, Eric.
But with a quick response. I mean, to me, I think looking at the pre-proposal analysis that was released earlier this year in January, it's pretty clear that, you know, the as might have been alluded to earlier in this conversation, that, you know, the more robust the resources are in this program, the more opportunity you have to make transformative investments in communities all across the state and in sectors all across the economy. That kind of gets swept under the rug when we have this big focus on focus areas or investment areas, as opposed to like what is actually driving the possibility and opportunity for transforming our economy. It's the amount of money that we have available to us in order to do the work, right? I know we're not talking about that today, but I'm going to say it out loud because it needs to be said. And so I'm gonna take this opportunity to say that it's really hard to have a conversation around prioritization of resources without having an understanding for the like sort of depth and breadth and volume of resources that you have. So like if I want to eat this week, I know I want to eat well, right? I know I want to eat food that is going to sustain my body and keep my family healthy. But, you know, as my dad would say, it's a quarter may as well be $1 million when you don't have two nickels to rub together. So if that's if we're going to be essentially talking about an anemic program, that changes the way we conceptualize and think about where some of our resources might go versus, you know, the $12 billion kind of version of the program that we see in the, right? So sorry, that's a big, long walk up a short pier to say is that regardless of the amount of resources that are available, I still continue to think that this notion of the two sectors that we need to invest in most in order to both meet our emissions reductions target under the CLCPA and support this idea of investing in programs that are driven by the felt impact of those investments for people who have been most clearly burdened by the fossil fuel economy are the ones that need to lead. And so if we don't do that, then we're essentially like missing the point. And it kind of feels to me as though we're investing in the kind of techno fetishist ideas of climate solutions that aren't really driving the needle on emissions reductions that make people understand and connect to the fact that these solutions work for us.
Thank you, Eric. Eunice?
Yeah, I was going to say maybe for question one, but since Eric raised it, yeah, I do think, you know, and Gloria mentioned this as well, and it's like the elephant in the room, I feel like, is the amount of revenue we're even talking about. And so, you know, your first question was just, you know, asking feedback on the framework. And, you know, your framework, the top two things, one is reducing greenhouse gas emissions and co-pollutant emissions. And the second thing I think is prioritizing climate justice. So I guess my comment would be, just going on Eric's comment, is if that is the principle we are holding ourselves to, then why are we seeing some of the regulations in the proposal that we are currently? I think it's like no surprise to DEC and NYSERDA that the PCU issue, I mean, it's one of many issues that we have with the pre-proposal analysis, but just using this as an example, to tie everything, I think, together, the regulation, the investment side, is, yeah, the scoping plan says that any capture and invest program has to set an enforceable declining limit on emissions. And the governor's own, you know, fiscal year 24 budget stated and directed at DEC NYSERDA to quote unquote design a program that ensures compliance with New York statewide emission reduction goals. Right now, even in the state's own modeling, the program doesn't do it with these PCUs. The price ceiling is too low, and they're unlimited price ceiling units. So there are just like, issues with this concept on top of other issues that we have with the pre-proposal. So what that means is, we're not reducing our emissions, not complying with the state law. It's not even a hard cap, let's be real. And second of all, this is going to ultimately, exactly like Eric and Gloria are saying, going to ultimately determine the amount of revenue. We're talking about potentially billions of dollars that we have for investment that can also be leveraged for affordability and, again, making low to moderate income households whole. So there's a lot of issues with the regulations. And again, like, I know we're not here to talk about the regulations, but we need to be able to at least state and talk about it in the way that these regulations are important, not only for reducing our emissions, both greenhouse gas and co-pollutants, but also on the revenue side. We've stated as an EJ org our many concerns with the cap and trade system that is being presented now. There are experiences in California where there are, negative outcomes from a cap and trade program. The California's own legislative analysis office did analysis of California's 22 scoping plan and concluded that California is not on track to meet their 2030 goals through cap and trade because the program's not stringent enough. Which we're going to have the same exact program if we have unlimited price ceilings units that are sold at a low price. So the regulation revenues, they're connected. And so, we do not want to forego billions of dollars of revenue. And so if we are to meaningfully make change and transform and usher in the just transition, we need more revenues, and that more revenue can make households whole and make things more affordable.
Thank you, Eunice, and so noted. Tailoring the discussion, Gloria, want to center this conversation and focus on the investment account. So Gloria.
All right, you want to put a muzzle on me here, but I'll just say this and then I'll move on. It's time for corporations to pay up. They've raised money, revenues, gotten wealthy on the backs of our communities, and now it's time. And now we're in trouble. We're in an existential crisis. It really is true. My husband hates to hear that term, but it's true. And it's time for them to pay up, and we need to hold them accountable. Okay, so let me look at your investment areas: clean transportation, transit, and mobility. In Queens, and again, Southeast Queens in particular, we are under siege from air, from land, from sea. I've talked about the airplanes. Land, because JFK Airport is right here, and it's one of the biggest air cargo, operations in the U.S. We have these big old 53-foot trucks and smaller going up and down our residential streets, going to our cargo warehouses. A lot of them are small, and I don't think they're transparent enough, and I'm not comfortable that we're capturing the harm that they're doing to our communities. Trucks going into waste transfer facilities, which we have out here in Southeast Queens as well. So that's air, that's land, that's sea. We have in-ground flooding that takes place that you don't need an extreme weather or even a rainfall in some of our homes for flooding to begin to take place because our water tables are so high. And there's no way to we don't have a standard way to lower those water tables pump the water out on a regular basis. So in an extreme weather condition, what we have is those homes and others that are, for some of us, it's a major inconvenience, but for others, it's a death experience. You think about Ida back in 2022, was it? So we are dealing with those burdens on all of those fronts. It's going to take a lot to address those things, but they need to be looked at. And those are areas that do definitely need investment. Research, investment in electric vehicles and smaller, I think they call them micro mobility vehicles, smaller vehicles that help to deliver our cargo from one place to the next. And actual programs of administration that look at some of these cargo warehouses, for example, and look at the transparency or lack thereof, and see how we're holding them accountable for emissions in our community, because I don't think we are. And I think even with the cap program and the caps on the suppliers of those fuels, if those suppliers come from states, if those trucks that are coming in and out of those warehouses are coming from states where there is no cap and invest program, their emissions aren't being contained, but we don't know what's going on in those cargo warehouses. So we can't even address that. And we don't know the impact in our communities. And it's all impacting our ability at the end of the day to reach our 2030, 2050 goals. So we need that kind of help to address those important investment needs. I like that community directed projects and capacity building in DACs, because in our communities, the good news is that we do have EJ organizations that are doing community-based science projects, including scientists and community members who are looking at some of these issues. And it's important for this initiative to connect in with them and to help them to maximize their effectiveness and to look at ways to mitigate some of the harms that are being done to our community.
Thank you, Gloria. And Monique, I see you have a comment.
Yeah, thank you, Angela, and everyone who spoke on this question. Gloria, thanks for bringing up waste, because I am a waste girly. Living next to a 50-year-old 270-foot landfill in Brookhaven. But I did want to just touch upon some of the priorities that we had kind of organizationally discussed, which is one that we already discussed throughout this this session, was building decarbonization, right? So can't say enough about how we need to prioritize building decarb. And just before I even get to all of that, just to say again, reiterate what folks have already said. We don't know how much money we're talking about, right? So this question is very hard, because one, as an advocate for a person who seeks justice, I want to prioritize everything because we need to, right? So I'll just say that, and then get into a few of the things and places that we need to prioritize without having an open pocketbook of funding and not even knowing what that pocketbook looks like. So building decarbonization, we've already talked about, but that's like one of the highest priorities that we have. The other one would be community directed projects, and Gloria already stated how important it is for our communities, community-based organizations that are closest on the ground, closest to communities, to know what the problems are, and already have kind of workshops, some solutions to have funding to actually get those projects off the ground, and also and when the projects are not envisioned yet, to have the capacity to actually sit down with consultants or whoever else that they need to really formulate these solutions that are centered in community health and not in profit or industry motives. So I would say that. And then again, we talked about transportation a little bit, but We want to prioritize the fact that transportation is another one of the most polluting industries in the state. And so we have to have an answer for that. And here on Long Island, I would have to mention the fact that we have a very poor public transit system. Even to say that we have a public transit system is probably overreaching what we have here. So it's inefficient, it's ineffective, and it makes us car dependent. And so having a car dependent region that is highly populated, Gloria mentioned Queens, Long Island has close to 3 million people on it. So we can't have 3 million people trying to have cars to get around. And if we don't have a public transit system that can speak to and get folks around, then we'll have this, communities that are people who are isolated from resources, from recreation, from family, from even their healthcare providers or work or anything. So we really need to make sure that we have a robust public transit system that is clean and able to meet the needs and be efficient for our communities. So transportation would be another one of those priorities. And then lastly, and I say it lastly, but it really could be number one, because if we're talking about transitioning to a clean or just society, we need a workforce that is able to do all of this, right? Even if we're talking about and prioritizing building decarbonization, we need a workforce to do that work. If we're talking about transit or transportation, we need a workforce to do that work. If we are trying to think of projects in the community, we need a workforce to do that work, right? So workforce development, it has to be a key priority, and we need to really kind of define what we mean by just transition, right? The workers need to be paid. They need to be able to live and have wages that will support them living wherever it is that they're living, right? So, and then, to kind of like ease some of the, tensions that we might see, we have to get ahead of this green economy. And when we are looking to bring things offline, we need to be offering these robust jobs so that people do not feel like they have to give up their livelihood to live a life that is environmentally safe. So I think I'll just leave it there. And yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much, Monique. Eric, and then we'll move to the final question.
Sure. I know we're running short on time here, so I'll be very quick. I think I wanted to take a moment to just highlight how important the community-directed projects and focus area is by just giving an example from the TCC, the California Transformative Climate Communities Program, that has really kind of been insightful to me about how robust the resources could be, but also how potentially meaningful the work being done within that program could be in this program if taken as a inspired model. The TCC program has 3 program objectives: to significantly reduce greenhouse gas emissions within environmental justice and disadvantaged communities, to improve public health and environmental benefits, and expand economic opportunity and shared prosperity. It has 5 transformative elements that all must be met within the context of the grant application. It must create a clear community engagement plan it must prioritize displacement avoidance. It must demonstrate in its implementation grants, it demonstrate a clear plan for workforce development, have a clear indicator and a performance evaluation tracking system that prioritizes climate adaptation and resiliency, and then leverage other co-funding in the process. That is huge. There's literally no program that NYSERDA runs that does any of that, not one. And so the largest grants available in the TCC program are around $30 million to do that kind of specific project-based work within disadvantaged communities across California. That is a lot of money. And that is the kind of like scale of resources that's necessary to drive impact in a community that's faced decadal disinvestment, decadal disproportionate burden, decadal essentially marginalization as a result of both the fossil fuel economy and the way in which we've sort of moved our energy related economic development work by prioritizing things like power for jobs that may not produce the kind of transformative economic impact that they put on paper, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm just naming a very clear like way in which you could think about not just sort of capacity building in a small way, but I'm talking about capacity building in a way that's going to, again, align with the notion of felt impact so that it is visibly and materially understood to be meaningful and impactful by the people who live in the places where these projects take place.
Thank you so much, Eric. Alana?
All right. Now we'll move on to the last question. So we're going to round this out with a discussion on the draft investment framework. Because we're running short on time, I'm going to ask folks to try to be brief so we can get to some of the questions from our folks here who are attending. So we're interested in whether you have any feedback to share on this draft and to refine how we guide the use of proceeds from the climate investment account. Gloria.
Okay, I'm going to suggest that, you know, the investment framework, I'm going to suggest that one of the things that I like about this is that it talks about looking at research. I think this is the one that talks about looking at ways that these funds need to be invested in research and development and innovative solutions. And I think that there's room and space in that for us to begin to look at something that I don't think has gotten, I know has not gotten the attention it needs in the CLCPA program. That is airplane emissions. The jet fuels from those airplanes emit ultrafine particles. And I don't think that studies of air that is not directly under the flight path is going to show us what that is, what concentrations it's in. And I don't think that if we don't look inside of homes, in that flight path and extend beyond to see how far this goes, we're not going to be able to tell what concentrations are in homes. And then we're not going to be able to talk about mitigation and impacts. So I see space here for looking at those kind of innovative, solutions. And I'm encouraged by it. And I hope that that happens. And I see space for getting private funds to help us to do that. And I see space for going out to the airlines and saying they need to come up with some of that. So those things encourage me. And there was something else, but I can't remember it. And I'll end there.
Thank you, Gloria. Eunice.
Yes. So part of my response to the earlier question was about this and that first bullet in the framework on the greenhouse gas emissions. I won't repeat that point again, but just another added point on that one specifically. Just want to emphasize the need to reduce our co-pollutants and not just think about greenhouse gas emissions. Obviously, the language here suggests that. But when we, even thinking about emerging technologies versus, mass deployment of solutions, we have our disposal now. There are technologies that don't that may reduce greenhouse gas emissions, but do not reduce co-pollutant emissions. Hydrogen blending, like for example, is a scenario where NOx increases. And there are other examples, carbon capture, like storage and sequestration, a lot of other technologies where, again, they purport to maybe reduce greenhouse gas emissions, like carbon, for example, but do not reduce co-pollutant emissions. And so I think that's another thing to think about. when we're thinking about different interventions, appropriate interventions, and also another reason why, as an EJ organization, we are pushing against false solutions, like low carbon fuel standard, for example. And so, yeah, just want to emphasize that, because oftentimes those solutions do not reduce co-pollutant emissions. And so that can't get lost as we think about emission reductions. We can't just focus on the carbon, methane. We need to be focused on NOx, SOx, PM 2.5, because as we know, those are the things that harm people's health at the end of the day. So maybe that's the only thing I'd add. I know you're trying to wrap it up.
Thank you, Eunice. Does anyone else have anything to add before we start answering some questions? Monique.
Yeah, I'll be really quick. I just wanted to reiterate, because I know I just mentioned it in the last question about the just transition and making sure we have a strong definition that is a shared belief of what just transition means. But I think that is very important when we're talking about frameworks. I also think that we need to also really be clear about what investments are, because I think sometimes we are thinking about investments in different ways, and we have to have a solid shared belief on what investments are for communities that are facing burden. And again, investments is dollars that go into a community, but if the dollars are going to a fossil fuel or polluting industry, then we're kind of being counterproductive. So we just got to be really clear about how we're spending this money and what we deem as investment. And lastly, I'll just reiterate that communities burdened by pollution need to see these infrastructures coming offline. And if we don't do that, then we are just allowing polluting infrastructures to pay to pollute us. So thank you.
Thank you, Monique. With that, I think we'll move to some questions from our attendees. So thank you very much, everyone.
Alana, may I just give a shout out to the Eastern Queens Alliance and the Southeast Queens Residents Environmental Justice Coalition. They're two of our really outstanding climate justice organizations, and they would do well to be able to be part of some kind of an ongoing on-the-ground task force that could be consulted with, especially as, Climate Justice Working Group does its work. Thank you.
Nope, absolutely. Monique, you still have is that a legacy hand or? All right, I'll kick it to Samir.
Great. Thanks, Alana. And thanks everyone for all of the great questions that have been submitted. Again, I'm Samir Wanade, Senior Advisor for Climate Justice at NYSERDA, and I'll be assisting with the question and answer portion of today's event. To try to answer as many questions as we can, we've grouped similar questions and we'll go through them by topic, and we'll be able to stay on for another 10 to 15 minutes past 3 o'clock to get through them if everyone can hang on. And as a reminder, today's webinar is on the climate investment account, so we will not be able to address questions related to the regulation development. And Alana, the first question is for you. Are disadvantaged communities defined by income or solely by race?
So disadvantaged communities, it's actually defined in the statute, in the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, but they're identified by the Climate Justice Working Group using 45 indicators of population characteristics and health vulnerabilities and environmental burdens and climate change risks. These 45 indicators are what makes up the disadvantaged communities criteria, and they are turned into percentile. They're based on peer-reviewed data that is collected at a census tract level and is applicable sort of statewide. So they are then transformed, those data sources are then transformed into percentiles. Those percentile points are then weighted, and we are generated a percentage and then generates a burden score. So that burden score is what determines what is a disadvantaged community. So it's actually 45 indicators, 20 from the population characteristics and health vulnerabilities, and 25 from population and health, and then 20 from environmental burdens and climate change risks. So race and income are part of the population characteristics and health vulnerabilities section, but there are also a whole other factor involved in that.
Great. Thank you, Alana. Angela, this next question is for you. What is the anticipated amount of funds that will flow into the Cap and Invest Fund?
So the amount of revenue projected to be generated by the New York Cap and Invest program allowance auctions will depend on a variety of factors, including design elements contained within the NYCI regulations to be promulgated by DEC and NYSERDA. And so we anticipate that the draft regulations will have accompanying analysis, including revenue projections, as well as other information later this year.
Thanks, Angela. Alana, this next one's for you. So we've received some questions around health issues in disadvantaged communities, such as high rates of asthma and respiratory illness due to pollution in these communities, and that this pollution exposure keeps increasing. So how can Cap and Invest investments address these issues and the need to act now in these communities?
So Cap and Invest could fund efforts like mitigation strategies that are being developed in partnership with communities in our DEC's Community Air Monitoring Program. For folks who maybe don't remember, the Community Air Monitoring Program was also part of the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act. It required that DEC establish a community air monitoring program in 4 disadvantaged communities, and Governor Hochul then increased that to 10 disadvantaged communities. So right now, the actual collection of data is over, and we're now going through the stage where we're letting community organizations and communities that are part of the study know what the results were, and that data that was collected is going to be used in partnership with these communities and these residents to develop mitigation strategies that we can hopefully use and be applicable across the state. So as these projects that come about from this process are tested and refined, the goal is to be able to replicate them throughout the state to improve air quality so that we can have some realized associated health benefits in these disadvantaged communities.
Great, thank you, Alana. Angela, this next one's for you. What's the status of NYCI regulations? What are the next steps?
So in the next few months, DEC and NYSERDA, we expect to formally propose draft regulations that incorporate the information we learned during the pre-proposal stakeholder process. And then this formal regulatory process will include a public comment period with at least 2 public hearings prior to finalization. This rigorous and transparent stakeholder and regulatory process led by DEC and NYSERDA is meant to ensure that New York's Cap and Invest benefits all consumers and keeps our economy's competitive advantage while maximizing economic returns and the potential for linkage with other jurisdictions.
Thanks, Angela. Alana, we're receiving a number of questions about how investments will be made consistent with all the information that we presented here today. So can you, go ahead.
Yeah, sure. So the best thing to do is submit your feedback through the comment portal, and Samir is going to go over that process right before we end. But those comments are all publicly viewable and available as part of the record of this, public position that's going to be used for the NYCI proceeds. So we really want to hear from people on this and, to keep us honest and remind us of what was said today. So we've provided the framework as a starting point for the feedback, and we really want you to use that and use that portal to get that feedback to us. This is the best way that we can effectuate investments on these and in other areas as well. So 100% make sure that you're submitting feedback.
Yep, and I look forward to sharing that once we're done here. Angela, we've received several questions and suggestions related to different investment areas, including energy efficiency for existing buildings, investments for smaller communities, support for workers, and low carbon transportation. How will agencies decide if these areas are eligible recipients of funds?
Okay. NYSERDA and DEC have kicked off this public process to identify and prioritize investment areas guided by the proposed NYCI investment framework. So this framework was developed with the Cap and Invest guiding principles and New York scoping plan in mind. NYSERDA and DEC will seek public input to refine this framework and the associated investment areas in order to inform how the executive budget proposal will allocate funds to the New York Cap and Invest climate investment account. So ultimately, the investment of New York Cap and Invest proceeds will be determined through the state budget process.
Great. And Angela, staying on the subject of investments, could the state discuss how it will determine which DACs will receive funding and how it'll determine the amount of that funding?
So we're seeking feedback on the priority issues and priority areas for investment, emphasizing the concerns in disadvantaged communities. And so how allocation of funds should be determined is one of the areas we're looking for feedback on.
Great. Well, that is actually all of the questions that we have. So this now brings us to the end of what we wanted to present here today. So on behalf of the NYCI team, I would like to thank you again for attending today's webinar. This was our public roundtable webinar focused on the use of NYCI proceeds from the climate investment account, featuring the critical perspective of environmental justice stakeholders. And this event builds on the series of 10 webinars and 2 roundtables held since June of 2023 to outline potential elements of New York's Cap and Invest program and identify specific areas where stakeholder feedback would be especially valuable. So if you'd like to access the recording of today's webinar or a PDF of the slide deck, both will be made available on the Cap and Invest website in the very near future. So please go to the website over the next couple of days if you're looking for those resources. As a reminder, details for future events and recordings of past webinars can be found on the meetings and events page of the Cap and Invest website. As we consider the questions that were raised here today, we strongly encourage you to provide feedback and ensure that your voice is heard. We are accepting comments on the use of NYCI proceeds at any time, but they will be most valuable to us if provided by September 30th. Feedback received by this deadline will support development of the governor's executive budget proposal for fiscal year 2026. And now, to ensure that you know how to share your feedback with the program team, I want to take a minute to walk you through the process of submitting public comments through the Cap and Invest website. Some of you may be familiar with the process to submit comments on regulations through the pre-proposal process, and you can continue to submit that feedback through the link that says Submit Rule Comments. However, we've set up a separate form specifically to collect your feedback on the climate investment account. So that's what I'd like to turn your attention to now. Here are the screenshots on the Cap and Invest website that you see on the slide. To submit comments for consideration, please click on the use of proceeds at the top of the page. There you'll find information on the NYCI proceeds account. And about halfway down the page is the Submit Investment Comments button. Also on this page is the PDF template that contains the specific questions that we've shared today and which may help you organize your feedback. The Submit Investment Comments button will direct you to the comment platform where you can directly enter comments or upload attachments that contain your comments. Next slide, please. So I really just want to give a big thank you to all of our EJ panelists for providing their time and invaluable perspectives today. This is valuable information to help guide this process. And thanks to the members of the public that joined us today. To ensure that you receive updates about future NYCI events and activities as the program development process proceeds, we would like to recommend that you sign up to the Climate Act mailing list. And you can do this by visiting capandinvest.ny.gov and following the button at the bottom of the homepage that says sign up for updates. You can also submit written feedback to the mailing address on the screen. I'll just read that. You can send that to New York State Energy Research and Development Authority, attention NYCI Investment Planning, 17 Columbia Circle, Albany, New York, 12203-6399. As a final reminder, we're accepting comments on the use of NYCI proceeds at any time. But again, we would appreciate it if you would provide your comments by the September 30, 2024 deadline so that the team can evaluate your feedback as they consider these issues. And before we go, I'd like to thank the panelists and all members of the public again for making the time to join this webinar today. We hope that the content provided has been informative and look forward to receiving any comments you may wish to submit. And this concludes today's Roundtable webinar. Have a great day, everyone.
Have a great day. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you, Gloria.
Thank you. Have a great day, everyone.
Have a good day.
Thank you.